Chapter 5, Part 3. I moved from pondering Father James' wisdom to revisiting the Apostle Paul's famous love hymn, in which he offers a magnificently obscure image of seeing in a mirror dimly, or in the King James glass darkly. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. Rather than a spiritual liability, the dark glass invites seers to spiritual maturity, to put away childish visions of the world, and in God's as simple and knowable. To put away childish visions of the world and its gods as simple and knowable, whose thoughts mirror one's own. The dark glass engenders humility. Since we don't know it all, we need others. Seasoned believers do not bemoan the dim mirror because they understand that obscurity is necessary for growth. In Christian mystical traditions, darkness is integral to the soul's journey, a positive spiritual good, not a malevolent force to be eradicated or exorcised. Darkness prepares believers for divine encounter. St. John of the Cross, a 16th century Spanish mystic, details the journey that readies the soul to receive God. On the path toward the divine union, one must undergo a period of purgation and preparation, the dark night of the soul, wherein the soul is made ready for the inestimable delights of the love of God. While the dark night is profoundly stripping and painful, as the soul is purified in this furnace like gold in a crucible, the darkness is not evil. To the contrary, John calls it this happy night, which marks an inflowing of God into the soul. The dark night, this happy night, is a necessary passage on the way to complete receptivity of the divine. Darkness, however, is no mere stopover on the way to more dazzling estate. Darkness is one's dwelling place. The darkness is enough, writes the Trappist monk Thomas Merson. It is the last line of a prayer he penned in the black hours before midnight mass on Christmas 1941, 2 weeks after he had entered the abbey at Gethsemane. Darkness is not only sufficient, it is also liberating. The night, O my Lord, is a time of freedom, Merton notes, reflecting upon his nighttime rounds as the fire watcher for the monastery. The night was never made to hide sin, but only to open infinite distances to charity and send our souls to play beyond the stars. Such endorsements of the night disrupt flimsy spiritual formulations that equate darkness with ignorance or evil. In 2010, 4 years before my grandfather's death, I had a transformative experience with darkness and its complementary relationship to light atop Mount Sinai. I admit a minister claiming to have had a religious encounter on Mount Sinai is a bit on the nose. My story, however, is not supernatural. My face did not shine, nor did I receive tablets of divine commands at the time. I did not have the words to describe what had so moved me. But as I reconsidered the metaphor of darkness in the months after Jack's funeral, my memories of Mount Sinai took on a new charity. Our ascent of the mountain began at 1 a.m. with a faint tapping at the door. Ryan and I and our friends, Matt and Hannah, were sound asleep after a long day on a hot bus, winding through the streets of metropolitan Cairo, slowly passing through the Suez checkpoint, bribing our way through military outposts in the Sinai Peninsula, and finally settling in at St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai. The knocking persisted, grew louder. "Matt, is that the guide?" Ryan asked. "It's too early." Matt growled. He rolled out of bed, cracked the door, muttered some Arabic, closed the door. He wants to leave now," Matt announced. Yusuf, our teenage Bedouin guide, had come to fetch us much earlier than we had planned. He said it would be better if we did not wait until later. He did not say why taking off at such an ungodly hour was preferable. It just was, and it seemed wise for us to trust him. From our sleep we quickly arose and began our nighttime ascent of the mountain in the pitch black, in the cold, with only the slobbery snorts and shit smell of camels and the dim light of Yusuf's iPod keeping us on the narrow path. Yusuf glided effortlessly in sandals upon the rocky earth, muffling our heavy breathing and ignoring the sweat that turned to icy scales on our foreheads and chins. We made no complaint as we trailed Yusuf's faint light and passed other pilgrims, many on camelback, as if they were standing still. The next day we met a young American tourist who said that it had taken him a full 3 hours to scale the mountain. Yusuf had us to the top in half that time. The last leg of the journey involved following tiny lights held by Bedouin men who crouched near the ground, illumining steep, narrow stone steps, courtesy or perhaps emergency lighting for those who had made it this far. Yusuf pointed to the rocky vertical path. "Go here." Then he and his light disappeared. His vanishing, which he executed so nonchalantly, unsettled me. When one travels an alien path, the absence of a guide can feel like an eternity. Once we had made it to the top at this point, there was no masking our heavy breathing. Yusuf reappeared. "Look at us," with what I read as judgment. "What took you so long?" And led us to a small stone wall at the edge of the mountain. He motioned for us to sit right along the edge and disappeared again. A small group of Bedouins camped nearby, but otherwise we were alone on the ledge. We shivered, huddled together for warmth, and waited in the darkness. I had never felt so awake. Soon we understood why Yusuf knocked on our door at 1 a.m. and why he had fast-tracked us up the mountain. As dawn approached, other pilgrims began arriving in droves. Our once private enclave by the stone wall became crowded. It was clear we had some of the best seats on the mountain. No one in front of us, nothing between us and the horizon. I was irritated by the late-coming German tourists who pressed in behind me. I turned my head back toward them to scowl. That was the last trifling moment I remember. I turned back to the wilderness. The hour had come. A banquet of arid pleasures spread out before us. Desert mountains and desert valleys and the sky refractive arc. A swelling luminosity touched thick darkness, unveiling the barren grandeur of peaks and plains, ridges converted from dark slate to deep indigo to creamy crimson. The lowlands followed in kind. Night and day held each other, a slow embrace of blues and golds, hues of grace, gilded light, finding home, complement, and balance in cerulean darkness. The two met in the thinnest of margins, at the slivered brink of bald horizon, honored equals, paying homage to their common source. Each passed through the other, awakening me from, as Merton put it, a dream of separateness. in a twinkling of an eye. The binding of light and dark and universal substance released me from an estrangement from the earth, from myself, held me in a beauty and truth that won't go into words, and just as quickly as it came, it was gone. The union hidden again, light in clear ascendancy, dark and light out of their fusion, delivered the other back to distinction, our circadian movement so endogenous to the earth's body, so mystifying to my own. We need to return to being two, writes the poet Mahmoud Darwish, so we can go on embracing each other. We soon stopped shuddering and shed our jackets as the sun overtook the mountain top. Now the risen sun shone brighter than I had ever seen at 6 a.m, as bright as any noonday sun. I squinted as I made my way down to the valley, now able to see the narrow mountain passes, the hairpin twists and turns from which the dark night had mercifully shielded me. For a few privileged moments atop Sinai, I stood in that place between night and the edge of light, endured a peace approaching perfect, desiring neither defeat for the dark nor triumph for the light. The moment of contact was enough. The two becoming one, then parting again, only to prepare for another reunion. Mount Sinai was not the first place I had encountered that thin place between light and dark. At the other end of the world, at the other end of the day, I had become familiar with this edge. In reverse, negative, tonight on the edge of dawn, this edge was between daylight and the edge of darkness. Here, too, equanimity emerges. The suburban neighborhood of my childhood was the site of my initiation into what I came to know as the golden hour. I grew up in a split-level house in a neighborhood erected in the 1970s in a 10,000-person town outside the 35,000-person Cape Girardeau. The subdivision used to be my family farm. After developers bulldozed the old farmhouse that we kids thought was haunted and ugly simply because it was not new, the only remnants of the farm were the street signs, which bore the names of members of the farm family. We lived on the patriarch's auto drive. Our backyard bumped up against his daughter's Charlotte Court, which intersected with his wife's Donna's Drive. Auto neighbors surrounded us to the sides and front. Charlotte neighbors hemmed us in from behind, and we sat in easy view of houses on Donna. We possessed only enough privacy to qualify as true suburbia. In our squeezed backyard, my dad constructed a camouflage tent, just tall enough for him to stand in and just wide enough to fit his tripod. The tent consisted of a skeleton of interlocking PVC pipes covered by an army tarp. It had a slit to walk through and a cut-out window flap the size of a sheet of notebook paper. I rarely entered the tent. My dad made clear that it was no playhouse for kids. A permanent fixture in our yard, it sat entirely out of place among the usual auto Charlotte Donna yard ornaments, bird baths, pansy planters, the occasional resin virgin. The neighbors knew about my daddy's hobby, which did not alleviate my embarrassment. Why couldn't he be like other subdivision dads who worked outside only in the interest of lawn maintenance and house repairs? After dinner, he retreated to his tent to take photographs of birds, and also, no doubt, to decompress from his daily work in law enforcement. He extended the telephoto lens through the window flap and waited in solitude. For a time I thought his evening photo sessions were out of utility, since he worked during the day after dinner was the only pocket of time he had to shoot. But not entirely so. One day he had told me about the golden hour, the small period of the morning and evening light that makes for the best photos, because the early morning's golden hour, the one I would later experience on Mount Sinai, was lost to work and school schedules, and my dad was never a morning person. I came to know the golden hour as primarily an evening occurrence, whereas daylight shines too directly to capture subtlety. The golden hour, also known as the magic hour, warms a subject and renders it in the proper texture, unleashing its full splendor. Direct sun sharpens the contrast between light and dark, creating deep pockets of shadow amid unforgiving brightness. Midday light can become so penetrative that it can lap itself. Harsh contrasts give way to no contrast. The light scorches a subject, running away its contours, which lends a washed-out quality to the image. Golden hour glow, conversely, releases subjects from harsh disparities, softening the shadows without being rid of them, holding the subject in tender embrace, whereas midday sun beats down. Golden hour light comes at a slant. More horizontal than vertical, it is egalitarian light. The light-dark dualism, so stark in the high beam of midday, recedes in the golden hour. Illumination and shadow converge, working in tandem to create a complex yet singular image. My dad's birds hung, framed on our walls, luminous goldfinches, hummingbirds, and their intricately hued wings, the auburn breasts of bluebirds, all tendered in warm and wondrous relief, courtesy of the golden hour and my dad's patient eye. While the rest of the neighbors stayed indoors, faces lit up by flickering screens that droned the same apocalyptic news, my father nested in his self-made tent. I had thought so embarrassing, waiting in quiet dust to capture the delicacies of lights and nuptial plumage in transfiguring light. The golden hour. Somehow, that phrase also leads me back to the summer after my college freshman year. The last summer of the millennium. A charismatic professor had convinced me to study abroad despite my reservations. I would be the first person in my immediate family to go abroad. It would be my first time flying alone, which frightened me, and I wondered if the course, Victorian London, was worth it. One evening I walked the hills of London's Hampstead Heath, searching for John Keats' house. I was 19 and of late had discovered Keats, his aching heart, his pen dripping with beauty and truth, and his spectre thin to tubercular death at 25. In the falling light, I came to what may have been his home. I remember little of the structure, only the ending of the day, old streets and old trees, and a peppering of despair. A small town Midwestern girl, 4,000 miles across land and sea from Otto Drive, searching for Keats in London's soft dying day. I was shot through with sorrowful comprehension, noting in my journal, by Keats' timeline, I have 6 more years to live, love, write. He dwelled with a beauty that must die, and so do I. So must I. All my life, even at 19, I had been prone to pregnant moments like these, what I now describe as golden hour moments, when the thin edge between life and death presses upon me, waking me from a drowsy numbness. There are times in a day and a life moments that can only be witnessed, never willed. When the inimitable heart of the universe swells across gulfs that seem impassable in ordinary time, tender is the night, that small, arresting phrase in Keats' Ode to a Nightingale has made a new kind of sense to me as I've revisited my golden hour experiences, defying dominant currents that equate black and deviance and darkness with violence. Keats offers the night, that heartbreaking word, tender, sensitive, soft, gentle. The cutting, contrastive noonday light gives way to the tender night. The tender night brings peace. It rounds sharp edges, blunting the blade that slices up the world, hastily dividing wheat from chaff, worthy from unworthy. The night invites surrender, a release of control, as we cease separating the world for a time. Keats' night, that embalmed darkness in which he hears the lone nightingale's song, calls him to a middling place between wakefulness and sleep, where he is half in love with easeful death, sleeping and waking find tender embrace. Death and life are loved in equal measure, neither is resisted. The golden hour provides passage to and from this tender night. Might golden hours offer a much-needed antidote to the idea of golden years? Golden years make for disappointment. I have heard many times through tears and gritted teeth, at the bedside, at the graveside, these were supposed to be the golden years. But instead, illness, chronic pain, financial woes, family strife, dementia, death, life's usual contradictions have cut them short or taken them away. And golden years, the idea of them, so often function, I think, as future reward, as the prize of staying dutiful and harried in the decades preceding them. Golden hours, however, might draw us more deeply into instead of away from the present moment. By no way of our own do we bring about golden hours, rather we receive them, allowing them to touch us, to move us to greater knowing, awakening us to impermanence. They come and go whether or not anyone takes note of their fleeting beauty. Golden hours help us to see ourselves, others, and our surroundings by a certain generous luminosity balanced by darkness. I recall a son who sat with his mother in an alcove bathed in natural light at the end of the dementia unit hallway. He would slowly flip a photo album, balancing it between them. Sometimes he pointed to a picture and offered a word of commentary, but mostly he was quiet. His mother looked content. Almost every afternoon they sat together in this manner. The son said of their practice, "If you wait long enough, something always comes." I was the new chaplain to the place at the time, new to the immense grace found in these moments of encounter. I have since taken his wisdom as a kind of initiation, a baptism into my work with persons who have dementia. If you wait long enough, something always comes. You must wait long enough. I tried to understand this waiting in the manner in which Thoreau understood certain still days he spent in the woods, as not time subtracted from your life, but so much more over and above your usual allowance. My grandfather had enjoyed center stage, relished the spotlight. Whether he was singing solos in church or serving as the Rotarian state governor or organizing a veterans group and writing its newsletters, Jack was unafraid of prominence. Always working on important projects, always instructing, always on the move, his transparent passion made him radiant. I admired my grandfather, but did not feel close to him. He seemed always above, remote, on stage. By design, stage lighting makes it easy for the audience to see the actors and hard for the actors to see the audience. I felt like the approving audience member, always seeing but never really being seen. And he, the faraway performer, was always being seen but never really seeing beyond the stage. My grandmother once told me that she saw her role as the hand clapper for her husband. She said this at a point of fact, not contention. She likely felt the spectator's distance too. Not long after we were married, in 2002, Ryan and I visited my grandparents. My grandfather played one of his three tenors albums on his stereo at the highest volume imaginable, nearly blasting it out of the room. Although his hearing was bad, it was not that bad. He stood and sang along operatically, making sweeping hand motions and lifting his head high, as if he were the fourth tenor. He took out his trombone from its case and played a few measures for us. As we sat on the ottoman, knees close to chest, staring up at him like schoolchildren, although there were certain oddities to the visit that probably pointed to early signs of dementia, he had some trouble working his stereo and finding certain words. The performance, the show and tell aspect of the visit were not so unusual, if somewhat amplified. What was new? For the first time, I felt the weight of the stage's obstructive distance, the strain it placed on our adult relationship. I sat still and heavy as a millstone, politely applauding Jack next to my clapping husband, aware of an enduring gap that may never close. Years later, in my grandfather's late dementia, I experienced a new tenderness in him. As the spotlights darkened and the house lights softly came up, he was no longer on stage. He was in a wheelchair. He lived in a nursing home where no one knew him from any other old veteran. He did not speak much. He hummed on occasion. My memories of him in these months are candle-lit. The circle of light he emanated was small but warm. A new stillness eclipsed his earlier frenetic disposition. At first it was hard to receive this new faintness as a gift. It was hard for my eyes to adjust to darkening after staring into such brightness for so long. It was hard to see anything at all, but once I adjusted to the lower light, I felt a kind of exhalation, relief. For the first time in my life, I sat with my grandfather eye to eye, no showing, no telling, no clapping, while his past light had beamed, attracting my attention and admiration, but barely my affection. His new darkling light was inviting, even gentle. I've wondered if one reason Jack appears so frequently in my writing is my effort to unpack the surprising trajectory of our relationship. Aren't I supposed to tell of my growing sense of alienation from my once close loved one, whose dementia now drives a wedge between us? However, our last visits together are more memorable and engaging to me, tug more at my inner chords than any other time I spent with him. The distance between us felt for once and at last bridgeable. As his lighting no longer crowded out his subtler shades and no longer crowded out me, I could finally see him as through a glass, dimly, not blinded by the bright glare, and maybe he could see me beside him, not as an entranced audience member, but as a friend in the waning light. In those final months, light seemed to find parity in dark. No longer a spellbound spectator, perhaps I was on the stage too, a kind of stagehand like Houdini's assistant Dorothy, attending to the notions of another's vanishing. On the afternoon of my last visit with my grandfather before his death, we sat outside together, he in his wheelchair, me on a bench, watching that pin oak in the front lawn of the veterans' home. All of my attempts to converse with him failed, and the silence that had originally made me squirm drove me to simply sit for a while and try to listen. Flags waved along the driveway, cars passed in the distance, and birds flitted between branches. The shadows grew longer and longer. Nightfall's hour grew nearer and nearer, but seemed not to reach us yet. My initial discomfort with the stillness gave way to a passing peace. The soft sound, the stretches of silence, the coming of the golden hour soothed the sting of coming departures. From the grounds of his rural Kentucky monastery, Merton writes of communion with the divine as being engulfed in the simple and lucid actuality of the afternoon, I mean God's afternoon. It is in the sinking light, what he calls this sacramental moment of time when the shadows will get longer and longer, in which he feels a special confirmation of his call to solitude. After noting the simple and lucid actualities, one small bird sings quietly in the cedars, one car goes by in the remote distance, and the cloak leaves move in the wind. Merton declares, "The more I am in it, the more I love it. One day it will possess me entirely, and no man will ever see me again." The elongating shadows of the afternoon confirm Merton's calling. The day's darkening delivers him to solitude. Merton exults in sylvan holiness, birdsong, cedars, wind, leaves. A lone car, the simple constituents of what he calls a day that goes by in prayer. Merton desires the growing shade to overtake him, to possess him so entirely that he emerges with it, vanishes into it, until no man will ever see me again. No longer a distinct, separate entity, Merton imagines a complete merger into the sacrament of the moment, the afternoon solitude, God. The next time I saw Jack, he was in peaceful repose, a gray suit in his coffin, stiller than still, possessed entirely, never to be seen again. I am seeing again my visit to the sculpture park in central New Jersey. By the time I had stepped out of Seward Johnson's rendering of the dream, the evening had grown late, reaching the tail end of the golden hour. It was too dark for photos without the stark intrusion of a flash. It was just light enough to see tracings of the landscape, but not its thousands of departures that make this, not that. The points of separation receded with the falling light as the darkening world descended into palpable unity. The above-ground roots appeared as small, dark waves. The tree branches bent, one touched the other and another. It was hard to track which limb swayed where. When I mostly knew by wind, sound, less and less by sight, the tips of the branches, their small leaves, converged into singular silhouette in concert with itself. On my way to the park's exit, I rounded the bend to discover Seward Johnson's interpretation of Matisse's The Dance. Swirling women in an interlocking circle, each curvy, nude, reflecting and holding the other. A world without end. Each bare woman stood 8 feet tall. Cast and aluminum together, they formed a towering union, an especially large ring. Johnson gave the title Daydream to his spin on The Dance. In his rendition, he has added a reclining man in the middle of the circle, arms behind his head, staring lustily up at the dancing women. I stepped over the lying daydreamer and stood beneath the whirl, wide-eyed under their soaring embrace. The lengthening shadow of their yoked arms enclosed me as we slow danced the light away, making way for the happy night.